You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Dr. Lawrence Frank to talk about how the built environment and the way we get around connect to public health outcomes. We also discuss the shortcomings of cost-benefit analysis and the systematic externalization of health benefits. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of subway crayonistas and city smarties, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scars. And if you want to just give a single dollar a month, you'll be able to get the podcast with zero outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to do it and how to get it into your podcatcher. We've also recently put up some bonus material and have weekly free posts from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, it's still winter, so get your heavyweight bus or bike scarves. You definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, and for the anti-bus activists you just want to frustrate. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. There are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from the bookshop site, either the books from the authors we interview or any book you like. bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the now 20-year-old daily newsletter at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 100,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes for that one as well. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's called Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements. But for now, just enjoy the show. Dr. Lawrence Frank, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Hello. Nice to talk with you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I grew up in Rochester, New York, and I was interested, even as a child, early life, in how environments, what I visited, made me feel. How safe or happy, connected, or in awe was a very clear interest of mine. I was always interested in design and movement through space. So as I grew up with that interest, I started thinking about architecture as a natural vocation, and then landed on landscape architecture as the focus for me, thinking about, in designing environments that were enjoyable and beautiful and functional for different purposes. And so I went into landscape architecture, University of Arizona. I have a strong environmental background or interest, always also thinking about not just from a transportation or any kind of thing like that. My early interest was really in beauty and enjoyment, and the kinds of options I had at that time was really to consider environmental psychology or landscape architecture as a way to apply ideas directly to place, and couldn't imagine as a 20-year-old the concept or prospect of going to college forever to do a PhD seemed overwhelming. Landscape architecture seemed more what I was interested in, and went through the program at University of Arizona, got licensed, practiced, went back and learned very quickly that the decisions and places that I was working on were very unimaginative and very car dependent and very monotonous. And right away became interested in, what happens upstream? How did it get, who makes the decisions that lead to the kinds of environments that end up getting built earlier on? And those are planners and engineers, in fact. Urban planning seemed like the logical fit for me. I went back to school, got a master's, and I tried to get a master's in urban planning at University of Washington, moved from Arizona to Seattle, wanted to live in a more urban cosmopolitan city, found it, loved Seattle. This was about 1987. I moved to Seattle, or 88, from Tucson, Arizona, where I had moved in 79. So anyways, in Seattle, got a real great opportunity, went to school there, was accepted into the urban design and planning program, switched over to civil engineering, got my master's in civil engineering, learned that I was actually more technically oriented and enjoyed at that point the content of what I basically went through the master's in civil transportation, but really my aptitudes were more contextual, were more social justice oriented, and perhaps a little bit more on the design side than the definition of design that's in engineering. It was very limited, more narrow for me, but very good background and training for me to understand the behavioral effect of environments, which became my area of focus. So by the time I was finishing my master's in around 91, I actually applied for and got in and did a PhD very quickly. I had already done a lot of the requirements and prerequisites. So by 93, I had a PhD in urban design and planning, and my dissertation and thing that I was interested in, and still am, is the relationship between the physical design of environments and people's behavior. And the behaviors can be not just travel. Social interaction was always a core part of my interest and sense of community. So I have really stuck with this place, behavior, exposure, and then health kind of naturally fell on top. I actually grew up in a medical household. My father was a physician. My mother ran the National Kidney Foundation. My brother became a physician, but I entered medicine or public health, I guess, in a very different way. That wasn't my primary interest. It's more of an outcome of the way cities are built.
You came from it from the right direction, though, because it's what you've been enjoying doing, and you've been doing it so well.
Thanks. Yeah, I was certainly early, and I think my publications on this topic predate everybody's. There's no doubt. You can just look at the record. There's no question. And I think it may have come from the fact I grew up in a house where health was so frequently discussed, but actually it was a natural outgrowth of the work, because what I did different than other colleagues of mine and other students, most others, with the exception of just a couple, I started studying active transportation. I started studying walking when that just wasn't anything that was done in transportation. If you went to transportation conferences in the late 80s, early 90s, people were not presenting papers much on walking. There was a couple others, but what I did that was a little bit different was I started studying how to predict it using parcel level land use data. I got right into the weeds on the data, which is kind of surprising because I had no clue earlier on that I would have ever done anything like that. I wasn't really computational or mathematically oriented at all, but conceptually definitely into the way the logic and how you measure things and how to predict something, the mechanisms. I got very intrigued and got really into research design very quickly. And my dissertation that published in 94 was really the first study to really start to map out a lot of these very detailed, spatially precise methods to predict walking. And that was really kind of the beginning. And then health happened right away because 96 was the Surgeon General's report that moderate physical activity, actually you're from Texas, you went to school there. So that was really where the focus started shifting to walking, because moderate physical activity became very clearly the population level change that we needed to make, that for really the masses, just getting people to be, physically not be sedentary for 30 minutes a day, just to get them moving a little bit by the early 90s became obviously the focus, mid 90s. So that's where the research really took off, because walking became very clearly the form of moderate physical activity that most people had been doing, ancestors, and for millennia, thousands of years. That's what we did, and we had engineered it out of our lives. You've heard that before.
Yeah, yes, I have. It's interesting because I did grow up in Texas. I'm in San Francisco now, but I grew up in Texas. I went to the University of Texas, and so I lived in Austin for 7 years. But I grew up in a place called Kingwood, just outside of Houston. And it's kind of the mirror image of the Woodlands, which is on the other side of the highway, which is where Ian McHarg tested some of his really famous work. And so it's interesting because what happened, I'll have a podcast about this coming out soon, but we had these greenbelt trails throughout the community, and we had like 75, 80 miles of them, and none of them crossed any major roads. They went underneath. If they did that, they had underpasses for them and everything. But it was this really rare place in Texas where I grew up, and it kind of shaped the way I looked at things. And it's interesting to hear you talk about walking and the way that we think about it now, and also cycling and active transportation generally. And at that time, I ran track and cross country, and these trails were just like something that we had and was available to us. And I didn't know any different until, I moved other places and they didn't exist anywhere else. And so I thought that was really interesting, especially in light of the evolution that you've talked about. And I'm also curious from your perspective, like thinking about it from the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s to now, there's been an explosion of discussion about the public health implications of walking, biking, active transportation, the built environment, the particulates and the car impacts of everything. And so I'm wondering what's changed since that, the time when you started working on this stuff versus now.
Right. Well, what's changed? I mean, we can track the evolution of the science. It went from, pre-experimental in terms of, I'll start off by answering what we know and what we're doing in terms of building communities. I'm going to go there next, and how the two relate or don't. So over the last 3 decades, we have learned that our notions about the connections between, when urban sprawl and public health was written, it was shortly after that. I'd already been working on the topic for like a decade when folks in public health, especially environmental health and CDC, started, really focusing on it. So it was really wonderful to see others join the bandwagon and start to really get interested.
This is your book from 2004.
Well, I was working on this for 15 years by the time '04 came around. So I had long been focused on this topic. And then we started seeing folks in public health, my co-authors, Frumkin and Jackson, got interested around the turn of the millennium. Around 2000, we started seeing. And then I had, previous to them, been working with, started conversations with folks in public health, in particular, Jim Salas, who I still work with, and who's been a very productive researcher and colleague of mine for a long time, where we started actually doing basic research on the topic. And physical activity, the physical activity, exercise science, and behavior and nutrition part of CDC, that whole chronic disease branch, they were in earlier. Environmental health came a little later and then took it on fully. But still, interesting to see different parts of the public health arena slowly engage in the built environment as it became topical. As it became topical, it attracted people who wanted to find things to talk about, who were interested, obviously, in environments and environmental health, and clearly interested in the fact that this topic attracts a lot of attention, and it's a way to potentially influence the wellness of the public. So anyways, well, the evolution you asked over the last 30 years, what's changed? Well, lots of different groups, as we've seen, slowly have come on board. As it becomes clearer and clearer through the evidence side, we build stronger evidence. Now, we've recently summarized, there's studies all over the world that we've found causal evidence exists. We started with notions, testing hypotheses, associations were established with lots of conjecture that it's self-selection and the things you're observing aren't really the environment, it's just masking the underlying attitudes and values. I've always viewed that as a wasteful use of energy, because what better situation than to have an unmet demand for something that people want to do that's good for them and good for the environment. I've actually always thought, so even if it is, the mechanism is only enabling the underlying attitudes, if that even were the case, which it's not, it would still make sense to provide more of that. Like all the more reason than if you had a situation where you were trying to promote something that underlying attitudes were the opposite. But in this case, we have coherence, we have adherence, we have, synergy, we have everything we need. And so getting on with building and actively shifting the funding within the transportation, I'm going to talk about within. So what are we building and how is that changing? We're doing a very poor job of that. We keep making terrible decisions. The economics underneath the decisions, the cost benefit analysis, the methodologies are so warped and so distorted. We systematically continue to externalize the economically derived health-based benefits that we get from investing in active transportation. Most of my work in the last decade's been on this topic. I've been a professor my whole career. Started at Georgia Tech, 8 years later went to Vancouver, University of British Columbia, was there for 18 years and then moved to the University of California, San Diego about 5 years ago. And then throughout my whole career, I've been working on this scientifically, but at the same time, I've run a company called Urban Design for Health. It started in 97, almost 30 years ago, 29. And that company has taken the evidence and applied it directly to one project after another with decision makers, end users, NGOs like Houston Air Alliance, trying to fight widening of the highway system in downtown Houston, or it could be the Los Angeles area, Southern California Association of Governments, our biggest MPO, where we monetize the health benefits of active transportation infrastructure investments. They had a $13 billion set aside, and we got hired to demonstrate the economic benefits. Lo and behold, when we ran the cost benefit model I hired AECOM, my subcontractor, and we measured directly the health related benefits that would be derived from this investment. We calculated an $8.41 return on that investment conservatively, not even including chronic disease of the elderly, where most chronic disease exists. And we ended up showing $100 billion return on investment through the life of the plan. So these are the kinds of things that we're just, it's shocking the degree of distortion that we've been able to allow happen. Of course, it's now looking at the way the world is. I suppose this isn't shocking at all. We should expect it. But what we're excluding costs bigger than the infrastructure costs that are even being considered by excluding the health impacts, the health related economic impacts, because it's not just reduction in cost of illness by avoided disease. It's the lack of engagement in workforce participation, workforce productivity, the fact that infrastructure, active transportation infrastructure, and transit both put money in people's pockets who spend money in the economy that give you a bigger multiplier rather than material-oriented investment in highways and roads that, concrete doesn't spend money. People do.
Yeah, that's the basis for the idea of the green dividend, which is one of the things that one of our friends, Joe Courtwright, has put together, which is basically you don't spend money on, gasoline in cars in Portland, and it actually stays in the economy and circulates. And then you get a higher, green dividend. The more amount of money that stays there, the more can be spent on the things that matter. For folks that might not be familiar, and I understand a lot of this stuff, but I'm curious, what are those economic benefits of the way that we should be building cities and our built environment? You talked about avoided health costs, but there's so many different things that go into the number amount that comes out when we say that there's $8 of benefit from every dollar spent. If you expanded upon that, what would you say is many of the reasons why we can save money when we're building towards a more active transportation system?
Well, as you pointed out, it's not just the reduction in illness and avoided cost of illness. Avoided cost of illness was about a third of the total benefit that we calculated. Another third was the workforce participation, workforce productivity, that healthy people, lower absenteeism is a big factor in the economics of industry and labor. So that's a fact that we know that that's unmeasured, uncaptured. When we tried to capture it, we ended up with about a third from that bucket. And then the other bucket, the other third, is tourism, the part I mentioned about capturing the land value. And then it's when you get the indirect effects, not just the direct effects, through the cost benefit analysis. Those are the pathways that we measured. I'm not really sure what else we would need to add, except that we did not calculate or capture the benefits. We haven't really monetized the mental health side of this. And it's not just about the money part, it's about the quality of life. We really like to put dollar signs on things. And in fact, we're not even doing that. But, past the money is really what kind of a world are we creating for people, and how well do people get to live, and how close to the life they would ideally want to be living are they able to live in the environments we're building. And so we have made some progress. I'd like to point out a couple things that have happened. I think many agencies are now quite familiar with health impact assessment, have done health impact assessments. They're starting at certain levels within government and within other industry. There's been obviously a raised awareness. People are aware of this topic. They're aware that these relationships exist. We failed terribly by there's no requirement that the health impacts be captured within decision making. So they're still externalized. We seem to capture the cost of the infrastructure, but we fail to measure the benefit. So it's very distorted. And that leads to the kinds of decisions that we're making. So our decision making approach is that the whole canvas of factors that we should be looking at, we're looking at like a quarter of it. And so where do we see improvement? I like to think that some more progressive cities are doing a better job trying to capture some of these benefits. I think we failed mostly on educating the public when it comes time to vote for decisions. We're really, what's in it for them? Their health, their wellness, their quality of life. That's what's in it for them. Their safety, their ability to age in the environments that they love, with the neighbors that they know. That's what they're missing. That's what's in it for them. And that should compel and motivate them to want to support the infrastructure decisions that are needed to retrofit. And yes, we can retrofit. We can change our communities, not everywhere, but in many targeted locations.
It's really about creating community through those investments and giving people a way to connect with the people around them. The thing that I feel like I've seen a lot recently, and this is an interesting kind of thing, is, from the health system perspective, folks missing their appointments. Also, if you have higher incidences of homeless who, if folks are given housing, they end up not going to the emergency room as much, and you save money from that. But it gets that idea of running cities like a business, and running cities like a business with a ledger that only takes costs and benefits into it is a really frustrating way of thinking about running a city.
We don't do that well at all. In fact,
No.
we're systematically externalizing the health-related benefits. They're not in cost-benefit analysis and transportation decisions. We may include the health part. There may be discussion around the health and the goals are there. But when you come down to the cost-benefit analysis, I know of no formalized approach to cost-benefit analysis that systematically captures. We systematically externalize the health-related impacts when we're making transportation decisions. When a transit line is compared to a roadway widening in a corridor, there's the indirect effect on the transit's benefit on health in monetary terms is never, if it's happened, it's very rare. Now, some transit agencies are talking about it, but within the roadway, within the MPO modeling a typical cost-benefit analysis process, when a roadway widening is considered, there's very little effort or even understanding that the health piece extends into economics, I believe.
Yeah, it does. It's been proven through a lot of the research out there. There's a research from Japan showing that after they built a transit station, the health costs for the neighborhood went down X number of dollars, or yen, I should say. There's research out there that shows this, and we just don't incorporate it. And there's also frustrating things that you discussed in your recent kind of replay of a paper that you wrote back in the early 2000s about how we still talk about cars and driving, but now we're focusing on electric cars and autonomous cars, but it still doesn't, negate the fact that you're not walking. You're still in the car, whether it's electric or autonomous or otherwise. And so that raises your risks of obesity by 6%, as you stated early on, and you've restated.
Per hour. Yeah, so that work started long ago. That was right about the time that we were working on those books. I had this huge project in Atlanta, and it afforded me the opportunity very early in this whole evolution of this new topic of health and built environment to focus on a variety of topics. And one of them was sedentary time in cars and car time. And that driving really is a predictor of obesity. And of course, it has to be because it's sitting. So the paper was invited for it to be revisited by the journal. I was invited to write an update. And much like your first question is, what have we learned? And, what have we changed? We've learned that in fact, every study that's been done since then, it's been replicated. I conceptualized it and did it first. And since then, it's been replicated many, many times to the extent that some people have written papers that are summaries of all the times it's been proven again and again to be. It's still true. It was true then, and it will be true in the future. So the finding is not an anomaly. It's so obvious that I got teased by my childhood friends. Like, you get paid to do that? Like, you got paid? My thought was it had never been conceptualized. Driving had never, ever been discussed before that as I'm spending all my time in my car and that's making me fat. I never heard anybody really say that. But if you can take something that's so fundamental, like so many people spend a lot of time driving, most Americans spend more time driving than they would like. And when they're stuck in traffic, they get really pissed off. So to be able to measure that not only are they being stuck in traffic, they're getting fat while they're doing it. They're getting unhealthy. They're getting unattractive. They're ruining a significant portion of their life doing it. And they're ruining the environment by doing it. So all that kind of fits together into a really kind of an, I wouldn't say nice, but a kind of an awful package of badness. And that was what kind of was maybe perhaps in a way clever about it, because it hadn't really been thought of that way as a direct shot at one behavior. So we were all studying and looking and ramping up studies on physical activity, the health benefits of being active, but the health cost of being inactive or driving was actually fairer game for criticism. And that's why I think it really resonated, and that's why it was so cited. And I think looking back, it was very organically conceived of while I was sitting in my car. And someone ran by, and I'm like, I have data to measure that. I'm going to do it. It wasn't even the intent of the study. It was kind of like a moment of awareness. It was like, wow, let's do that. So what we've learned, obviously the metrics and how to measure stuff isn't really that interesting for our discussion, except to know that we have really good data to measure it now because we have our phones. So we can measure it better, but that's not going to change decision making around this topic. It's so understood. So the thing is, in our decision making apparatus, we rely heavily on this cost benefit analysis approach. We really think that that's the gold standard. And so if we're going to use it, then we at least are responsible to include the costs and the benefits, the big ones. You shouldn't be allowed to eliminate something that's massive. If it's like a minor economic impact, a triviality, fine. But when we're talking about health, which is a significant portion of our entire economy, and how it's related to something as fundamental as how we get around every day and how we build our communities, we're really responsible to capture that. And that's sort of the point, is that we need to inspire ourselves, our students, the people that are coming after us into this field. And that's what I think my colleagues, the people I've written books with, and others are interested in doing, is that we certainly want to have known that we were able to push this forward enough that it is more and more difficult to ignore. And that's what my company's been doing, is through this National Public Health Assessment model, we call it NFAM, that tool is effectively helping those in locations of government, NGOs, are able to get that evidence right into the decision-making process right then. So we were able to use it to protect that $13 billion in Los Angeles. We were able to use it in Houston. Buttigieg was able to, I was part of a group and some of that evidence helped there. We're able to contribute and in some places directly help. And really, there are certain places along the way where there's a window of opportunity and you need to have the evidence right there to make a difference, where there's a legal challenge. And that's what this has been able to do, so that we now have case studies. We've got about 15 regions. Sacramento's regional planning agency, the Sacramento Council of Governments, SACOG, has used our tool, our work. We just finished working with them on their long-range transportation plan, and they were able to make some headway, maybe shift the discussion a little bit more towards a more compact future for that region, all else being equal. There's a lot of debate that happened, with them. San Joaquin Council of Governments, we've worked with them 3 times now on their transportation update, their long-range plan. And they've been very focused on equity and environmental justice and trying to invest active transportation improvements into their lower income minority communities. And this evidence helped them do that. We published on that extensively. There's a number of case studies around the country where we've actually had an impact. And right now we're working in St. Louis with an authority that's responsible for the Great River Greenway, authority that's responsible for building bike infrastructure and active transportation greenways throughout the St. Louis region. I think we're learning a lot there in terms of ways to influence, help them get the data and evidence showing the health, quantifying the health and related economic benefits of the investments that they're making in that region. So those are meaningful, practical opportunities.
Do they come to you usually, or do you have to reach out to them and say, hey, we have this ability to measure public health impacts, and so we need to, get that into the long range plan?
We've not really actively marketed in the way we should and need to. I've been very focused on being a professor and running my research programs at the university. So the company has done well. It's lasted 30 years, but we've really been focused largely on where opportunities have come our way through pretty much word of mouth. But I put a newsletter out once a year. I don't know who gets it, but it's a pretty small, I don't know, but I wish I'd sort of marketed more. But I did want to mention one thing, which is recently with AI and digital images, it's become possible to expand our definition of what walkability really is. So there are certain points in time where the science advances enough in a way that makes it really more useful for the public. And I know in your podcast and your show, obviously you're interested in the way places get built, our quality of life. And so science is really a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. For me either, actually. I don't think the public get all jazzed and listeners about, equations or metrics. Maybe
this podcast maybe might be a little different than that.
Listeners are interested in concepts and logic and clear thinking. So here's a big one. So all of these years, for 30 years, we've been measuring walkability without data on even where the sidewalks are. So I did the algorithms, I did the research that led to Walk Score 3 times, actually, brought that to Matt Lerner, who was working at Front Seat.
Yeah, we know Matt.
Eric Prine was a reporter in the Seattle Times, published our walkability map. Matt asked me to go for coffee, and we started talking, and I shared with him how we measure it. And then he went and built a first walk score that was airline distance, people walking across water. And that became a problem. So there was a grant from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that I got. I gave part of the money to Matt and actually gave him our results. And that's where we measured walk score using network distance. And we built algorithms that I imagine got incorporated into their tool, although it was never really formally acknowledged. But we published that paper in 2021. So we've built a lot of tools, but we never knew where people could really walk because we never really mapped as much in our walkability definition, for national data sets that we build, the Smart Location Database for the US EPA. That's a very commonly used data set. We build the National Environment Data Set for Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Culture of Health. We build the metrics that go into their annual report card. We were doing that for quite a while using some of these national data that we were able to put together at the census block group level. So anyways, none of it had pedestrian features. We didn't know where the benches were. We didn't know where the sidewalks were in those data sets. In our carefully done studies where we get a lot more funding to study an area, we walk around and map everything, and we know these features matter. We published on it. But now with AI, using machine learning, we can have digital images scanned and reviewed. So we're able to measure and incorporate more in an automated way things that have a tremendous cost benefit: sidewalks, seating, lighting, street furniture, trees, shade, eyes on the street. All of these things give us incredible return on investment when they're invested in communities that are high concentrations of chronic disease because they're lower income minority and where these things are missing. So I just wanted to make the point that we're getting a little bit of interest in advancement because the definition in the minds of, I think, the public, your listeners and others who are perhaps not in this field professionally, but interested in it, all of us, our definition of how walkable our neighborhood is more a function of how easy it actually and safe it is to walk. So these features are now becoming, as they always should have been, part of the walkability rubric and measurement.
You wrote a recent paper about this with a bunch of other folks about measuring walkability from the built environment. And what was interesting to me is the difference between whether older women or older men adapted to it was really interesting. And there was a small difference there, at least, that popped up.
Totally. Yeah. We know that women are more sensitive to the presence and absence of these features, if it's safe to walk in terms of traffic, but also there's a security part as well that's safety from crime. I just gave a lecture to my students here at UCSD today and covered this topic, which is that, we are all uniquely different in terms of our demographics, the different demographic subgroups, women versus men, old versus young, rich versus poor, react and respond very differently to different types of investments that we make in communities. And we do know, we've published before, that walkability seems to predict active transportation in men better than women. I believe a study came out of Stanford, led by Dr. Abby King, a longtime colleague of mine, recently published in, I believe, Nature, showed this finding again, still showing differences. The models better predicted men than female physical activity using, I think, cell phones. So now we're able to capture that better. And what we've learned from my PhD student, Vinay Adhikari, who's finished his dissertation at the University of British Columbia, he found in his work, he focused on pedestrian microscale, these pedestrian design features I mentioned, the sidewalks, the seating, the lighting. He incorporated that into his work. And by doing so, he was able to demonstrate that that is actually what needs to be present for women to walk more. And this was in a group of older adults. So we're learning, that there are certain things that matter to different subgroups in order for them to really engage more fully in their community, into the investment and to benefit.
That gets me into some of the equity implications of walkability and whether people have safe streets. There's the heat island effect, and whether there's tree cover or not, the amount of particulates and emissions that come from major roads that are near certain neighborhoods and things like that. There's definitely a difference between, who can and can't actually access the built environment that is most beneficial.
You remind me of something that I wanted to mention earlier, is that part of our work over the many years with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was done in tandem with RAND Corporation. And they're the primary consultant that help with the culture of health with the annual report card. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has sort of the built, natural, and social environment components of they track. And the social environment really, in a big focus, as it should be with their work, is in the equity and social justice implications around public health. What we know over the years is that walkability is a poor predictor of health characteristics in the most underserved. And the reason is that walkability is systematically where it's more walkable. Wealthy people who live in walkable environments get walkability with all the good stuff, the parks, the green space, the good transit access, shops and services, all the amenities. Poor don't get that. They get walkability with air pollution, with noise, injury risk, and lack of trees. So walkability doesn't perform well for the lowest decile of income. It's not a good predictor. But it's not that the walkability is the problem, it's what it's associated with. So we have to remember that these relationships exist between opportunity that's created through walkability and the impact of other factors that hang along with it or don't. So if you're poor, you're going to have to live on the busy street, right where the air pollution is, not 2 blocks away. So you're going to have the noise, you're going to have the air pollution. And we know, in fact, I did a study in 2007 that was right about 2006, 2007 in Vancouver with some other colleagues, showing that walkability is a great predictor of exposure to air pollution, small particulates. And so that's bad news. It sure is. But for wealthy people, they're not experiencing that because the particulates, the air pollution effect dissipates. It's only right next to the busy streets. So that is where land value is lower and where it's less desirable to live. And so we have these social justice impacts. And so it's good you bring up. A lot of the discussion we've had has been focused on how walkability affects behavior. and how those behaviors then affect chronic disease through weight and not just directly. But at the same time, environmental impacts just by merely location determine if you're going to be breathing healthier, clean air, if you're going to be exposed to injury risk, if the noise is going to be high, and that's going to affect your blood cortisol levels. All of those factors are happening at the same time. And so we have to be mindful of the behavior and exposure interface. Those things really matter.
Yeah. Michael Eisen, who is in Seattle now and writes a lot about single stair buildings and development in these neighborhoods, he came on the show and talked about, we've been thinking about when we do these master plans for cities, development plans or urbanist plans, we put a lot of the density near these major roadways. And so we've been doing this for 20, 30 years where we think about the core and the main arterial where the transit's going to go. And so that might be the most natural place for a tall building and where people will be in a place where it's more walkable. You saw this in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor in Washington, D.C., where they protected the suburbs and they put everything on that dense corridor. And so now there's a discussion about, well, should we really be doing that? We're putting people in harm's way. If there's cars and if there's, particulate matter, if there's emissions, maybe we should be thinking about putting more people inside of these neighborhoods instead of on the edges where they are more impacted, as you just mentioned.
Of course. And there we are coming right back to the cost benefit issue. Therefore, we need to document that there is a greater economic benefit of, or do we? I think that's the bigger question. Like, if it leads to healthier people, maybe the economics shouldn't be the main factor. But you nonetheless have the argument. The reason we've always put, the density along the busy streets or that the development goes there. Well, California statewide is doing everything it can to try to create affordable housing. Well, where is that housing going to go? It's not going to go on the most expensive land. And this is our problem as a society, is that if you lead with the money, if you make the decision from a practical governance perspective, you only have so much resource. So if your goal is to maximize the benefit of that resource and you want to provide as much housing as possible, if the land costs way more, you're going to have much less housing built. But if we're able to demonstrate through the research that, in fact, when you internalize the downstream health effects of this land use decision, whether or not the growth goes right in the busy streets or 2 streets in, yields a greater cost benefit, then maybe we would change some decisions. Or maybe there's a compromise. Some other solutions could be developed, especially in the way we distribute our transportation funding. There might be other creative ways that we can go about that decision-making process, because that's really the key. So land use decisions are predicated on legal tools, right? That we use zoning. Development regulations, whether they be subdivision, zoning, or building codes, 3 levels. And those decisions are supposed to support public health. So have any of your other speakers spoken to the legal use of zoning?
We had Nolan Gray on to talk about his book, Arbitrary Lines. I don't know if you've read that one. We had folks on recently talking about the history of planning in the United States. Yoni Applebaum came on to talk about his book, Stuck. I don't know if you read that one. Ben Schneider came on and talked recently about Euclid versus Ambler Realty. The dissenting opinion of the Supreme Court at that time mentioned that people expected change over time. They expected things to get bigger. And so when that court case came through and changed zoning forever in the United States, it made us go in a different trajectory. A lot of that stuff's really interesting, and we have covered that a number of times on the show.
Wonderful. Well, you're covering a lot of really great stuff, Jeff. I mean, you have a really unique overview of what's going on through your interactions with other people that are each doing a piece of this. So we just finished an analysis, a global review of causal evidence of how the built environment affects body weight, as just an overall catchment of health. There's a reason we did that. We were funded by Novo Nordisk, and they were interested in weight trajectories. But we have come to the end of that, and I was writing up this study, and I didn't want to do another lit review, because it is, even though it's of causal evidence, and the good news is there's a lot. There's a bunch of causal evidence, which is great. But I'm targeting it in trying to wrap it around the decision-making that we do. because causation should matter more than other evidence levels. It meets us the level where I don't think writing up a review in the absence of what the decisions that are being made around that topic is appropriate.
I've been thinking about this a lot too. I mean, as I mentioned, we've talked to a lot of folks and a lot of this stuff overlaps and everything matters. We've been doing our newsletter for 20 years now every day. We go through about 1,500 news items a day and we pull out the 40 that we think are the most interesting in a number of different categories: environment, urban issues, design, transportation, and everything is connected. I've had folks ask me, like, can you just do transportation? I was like, no, I can't do just transportation because it's not just about transportation. It's about all of this because it all connects to itself. And so, I've been trying to think about like what is the most equitable way all of this comes together. And it's really hard because there are so many topics. You could write 10 Lewis Mumford's The City and Histories in that time period and still not get to the bottom or connect the dots the way that maybe they should be. And so it's really hard because there is so much, but the first person that does it and puts everything together that can actually make sense of everything. And it does make sense to us because you've read the literature, in all the different topic areas, and they all connect. The public health. I rambled a little bit earlier about, homelessness and housing and healthcare costs and a number of things, but they all connect to transportation and the way our built environment is designed, the way that we subsidize things back in the 50s and 60s, the way that the Robinson-Patman Act was ignored by the Reagan administration and caused food deserts because they allowed unfair competition between big box stores and local groceries. Those types of things all come together in one thing. I'm toying with this idea that we had an off-ramp ability in the 70s with the oil crisis and we didn't take it. And
absolutely,
there's a lot to be said about that. And going back to my neighborhood that was built in the 70s, it was built by folks who were inspired by Columbia, Maryland, and Victor Gruen and other folks like that. And there was a neighborhood. The Woodlands is similar, which is designed by Ian McHarg in Texas. It's still a suburb, but you can get around everywhere on a bike without crossing a major road. You can get everywhere in the subdivision without, getting in your car. And so there was an opportunity to make cities and places that were better, but we didn't take it. And so now we're suffering all of these impacts, these health impacts, these horrible outcomes of our built environment, obesity, dementia, Alzheimer's, everything that you can think of under the sun, the chronic diseases, the degradation of our environment. And it comes from the way that we think about our communities as just a place that isn't connected to everything else in which it is.
Totally. Well, that's our sandbox, right?
It's a big sandbox.
Well, it is. But, the balance is that we have to, in order, for the communication part of it, you got to take a slice. You try to do everything, then people get lost. And so you have to pick a logical, really good connection between a few things.
Yeah.
I think if you do two things, it's two, you can go to three, maybe four. But when you get past a number of discrete phenomena, it becomes too messy. So I think we can get the connection from the physical design of environment to behavior and an exposure and health and cost. I stay in there mostly, but occasionally I'll, go outside of that a little bit. And I think this advancement around AI, capturing the pedestrian features are modifiable. They're less subject to neighborhood resistance than other densification. I mean, San Diego, where I'm living now, is just so that you can't even talk about putting, developers, they're letting a few projects by and happen. But we have train stations that have opened 5 years ago that have no density there. It's unbelievable. There's no air rights discussion. It's a city of 4 million people almost. There's no air rights utilization in many of the train stations that have just opened. They're not even talking about it. It's as if it doesn't have any value. And we have terrible traffic congestion. So it's like, when would it ever kick in? Like, how could that even be? We're having a massive debate. They want to charge for parking in Balboa Park, where all the museums are. Can you imagine? I can't imagine. I told them I can't imagine how they don't. Mm-hmm. I can't even believe that the parking is free in Balboa Park. My neighbors walking by, I live relatively close by, they asked me and that we were talking. They walked away when I told them my opinion. They don't even want to talk to me. They hate that. You want to charge for parking, or you like those bike lanes that they put in? I'm like, I went backwards 30 years when I left Vancouver and moved here. It's like I'm in a, I don't know, like it's just like going backwards 30 years.
You're like a Twilight Zone almost.
Well, it is. It's hard to believe. So we have these different places that are all very different. We're a very heterogeneous culture, obviously. And so even if we can bring along a quarter or a fifth of the society enough that it's frustrating when you know that there's that much evidence. I think we're in a tough spot right now in this moment in history where the topic that we're talking about today is so unsupported.
Yeah.
That is a big setback.
It's frustrating. David Roberts, who wrote for Grist for a long time and now has his own podcast called Volts, recently had somebody on talking about how evidence is hard to get through to people who don't want to believe it. The people that you were talking about in Balboa Park about parking, obviously that space is owned by the city and residents should get the most value out of it that they possibly can one way or another. And we should share that space, right? And the best way to share it is to price it. But he was talking to him about misinformation and how basically we need a lot of organizing. It's not just the information that we have, like you've created such great information. We have the podcast, we share information, but it's also about organizing people to disseminate that information, to socially prove to other people that this is a positive way to go. It's one of these things I've been kind of leaning towards. We had Carter Lavin on the show, who is an organizer here in the Bay Area, and he wrote a book about how to organize around transportation, because it's not enough to be right. Right. It's not enough to be right about everything. You have to, tell people it's right, but then you also have to get them to believe you and to go along with you. And so the best way of doing that is to getting into the trenches, talking to people, organizing with them, maybe winning a ballot measure with them, getting people involved. And so I'm leaning towards that is like, we're going to get there, but we have work to do. And we need, all the tools that we have available, whether that's the research or the information that we know is right. But we need to, tell everybody else about it. And it's just changing a culture. And I find that there's a lot of stuff out there specifically online that is helping, right? Like City Nerd, Ray DeLahunty, the War on Cars folks, whether you like the term war on cars or not, they're actually building a culture and getting people to talk with other people about this topic and creating an organizing principle. I mean, those guys and the folks in New York City who fought back against Kathy Hochul's pause of congestion pricing really did bring it back. No matter what Kathy says, no matter what Governor Hochul says, she said they were always going to be turned back on. I don't actually believe that. It was the pressure from the social organizing that happened over time. And so in order to make these changes, we need that to happen. We need that social pressure on political folks, on elected officials that comes from this knowledge that we've built up over time, the knowledge that you've built up over time.
That's very helpful. Both sides of the aisle, there seems to be some agreement over the fact that, aging in an environment where you can't walk is bad. So there's a little bit of, and safety seems to be the one topic that survives Republican administrations when we have them.
Yeah, there was an article this last week in Streets Blog USA by Kia Wilson talking about aging in place and the ticking time bomb that's out there related to all of the baby boomers turning into 65 plus and the transportation challenges and loneliness epidemic, the problems that will exist when people can't get out of their houses and they can't get to their healthcare and they can't do this, that, the other thing because they don't have the active transportation because they're not allowed to drive anymore, or they're not mentally fit to drive or physically fit to drive anymore.
Yep.
And so that is a huge challenge, and it's going to hit everybody. And so hopefully that breaks through in terms of politics.
I think that's happening. You're right. That's happening right now. I was thinking that one of the things I think we can do is better organize ourselves and help each other, where you see someone's a really good communicator, line them up with, someone is not just good at the communication, but you have evidence producers, knowledge creators, communicators, and then publicists, people that are actually, or that are in the media, these different camps. And the more horizontal connection across between, so that we take the evidence that we have and generate it as a society more collectively and connect the people. Really good knowledge producers need to be connected with good media, savvy media people. so that, and they get recognized as the researcher, not just have it handed off to, people that talk about it and bump off the researcher, because that happens a lot. You're in a position where you kind of have a mental map of, these are people that do a lot of writing, or good writers, good, and they're connected, they're in the press, and then people that are good communicating, all of that. That I think we could accelerate a lot of change. And then people in government positions, of course, who are, obviously the decision makers, you want as many of those as you can. Those are the kind of things that might give more legs to our effort. It's very frustrating to see the cost benefit thing is kind of where I'm focused the most now. We have a lot of case studies where we've monetized and demonstrated the scale of the economic impacts. And I think that maybe is an area where we'll hopefully work.
What are you most excited about, or what are you most hopeful about? There's been a lot of negative news lately, and I find that I need to have something to grab onto. I recently went to China with my wife and hung out there for a month and visited my daughter's grandparents. And it was just amazing to see what society could do if it, pulled together. I understand the differences in governing systems and all that stuff, but 48,000 miles of high-speed rail is 48,000 miles. And so I'm wondering what you kind of gravitate towards, what you're getting positive vibes from, what you're excited about.
One area of advance that I'm a little bit excited about is in 2017 or 2018, we submitted a patent application to take AI detected pedestrian features and use them to predict physical activity, document health benefits, monetize those benefits, and then develop an optimization cost method to optimize what you would do in a given location. And that patent was awarded in 2021. In 2024, we updated it to include mental health. And I'm very enthusiastic and excited about, we developed a commercialization and marketing plan for that, which identifies two different groups of end users for that technology, which collectively I think could really bring to the general public and to professionals tools that could be used like on your phone to navigate. WalkScore tells us, for example, where their destinations, but this would be a real way to know I'm planning a trip, I'm going to Europe, and I want to stay in hotels. I'm partially handicapped, and I need to have, places within 300 feet that I can walk to. So you'll know where the actual truly walkable places are to live, to visit, and all that. So I'm excited about that, and hopefully bringing that technology forward for everybody to use. We're kind of rolling out a lot of decision support infrastructure. That stuff's going to be helpful. So I feel like some closure, because that's sort of, getting it really out into the world. So I'm really happy about that. And I'm also excited to see not only the tools getting used more, having an impact, but I always look at life that every action has a reaction. And the pendulum just like slammed right now in our country so far, to the right. And I believe that the kind of response, there's a lot of changes and a lot of dialogues right now that are encouraging. It's shifting. And so I think we should remember that in this moment. This is not our brightest hour today, but it could be not long before we see the sun again.
Where can folks find you and find your research?
At www.ud4h.com. And then also at UCSD, they can search for me at UCSD, and also send an email, ldfrank@ud4h.com. I collaborate a lot with different people, and especially with end users. That's always been the most fun, because they actually take your work and apply it, and something doesn't get built that you didn't want to have built ideally, or something happens that wouldn't have otherwise. Maybe the most satisfying was to be part of that large coalition of people that really stopped the freeway widening in Houston, or, in Los Angeles, really made it possible for that money to remain on active transportation. And most interestingly, I guess, is that when that challenge came within Los Angeles from the roadway lobbies, they literally, I don't think, had any idea that there would even possibly be an economic argument that would be made their probably thought was sidewalks and bikeways are nice, but that's not going to get goods to market. We build the economy. We're not a triviality. That's not a nicety. But when we came back and showed, no, this in fact is how people remain healthy, there's an economic benefit of that that's huge. I think that probably really surprised them. I don't think they were expecting that. I think they were thinking this money's fair game. We're going to grab it. We're going after it.
Yeah. Well, it's good that we can do that. We can push back on that because we need it. We've been building too much of the wrong thing for too long. Well, Dr. Frank, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jeff. I look forward to talking with you more.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways. Hey everybody, we're past the main credits. Here we are at the end of the show. But I do want to give a shout out to some of our $10 a month or more Patreon supporters who've been helping the show along with your very, very generous support. If you've made it this far, you're probably a really big listener and reader. We really appreciate that. When I get new supporters, I'll update this section, so I hope that happens often. First names only, but big thanks to Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabriel, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mao, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Abraham, Oliver, Steve, Abby, Ed, Matthew, and recently added Sylvia. Everybody who listens to this show and reads the newsletter is much, much appreciated. I just wanted to give our biggest supporters a little extra love and recognition. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.